Joseph Francois Leon Arnoux, generally known as Leon Arnoux, was born in Toulouse in southwest France in 1816. His father was a successful earthenware and porcelain manufacturer, and Leon was sent to Paris when in his teens to study engineering. But he also attended at the Sèvres porcelain factory, the Royal Porcelain Factory, where he studied painting on china and the glazes and the colours that were needed for decorating porcelain. When he'd finished his studies in Paris, he returned to Toulouse, where he took over the management of his father's porcelain factory. In 1848, there were revolutions all across Europe, including in France, and this affected trade very badly. The porcelain factory was forced to close, and the young Arnoux decided to take advantage of the situation by travelling to England to visit the various pottery-making districts. This, of course, included Stoke-on-Trent, and there he met Herbert Minton, the innovative and entrepreneurial potter whose factory dominated the centre of Stoke-on-Trent itself. Herbert Minton was very taken with Arnoux. The two men got on well, and Arnoux was offered a post by Minton to come to Stoke-on-Trent and to work on developing a new porcelain body. Within 12 months, Arnoux had risen to the post of art director for the factory. It was a post he was to retain for over 40 years until his retirement. But the title doesn't really cover what he did. He was essentially responsible for all the product and development design across the factory, everything from tiles to porcelain to earthenwares, and he was largely responsible for the massive expansion of the Minton factory during the 19th century. Although he was a good artist and designer in his own right, it's not for those qualities that Arnoux was so important to the Minton factory. He was a brilliant chemist. He created hundreds of new glazes, both for porcelain and for majolica. He was able to copy the Sèvres glazes that were so admired at the time and to put them into production. As well as glazes and colour effects, Arnoux also introduced a whole variety of new bodies, earthenware and porcelain, including particularly majolica, which became so popular and was imitated by so many factories. He oversaw the Minton factory, and in particular its entries for the very important international exhibitions from the 1851 exhibition onwards. In addition to all of this, he also, as an engineer, created and patented the Minton downdraft oven, which was to be installed at the Minton factory, and the rights to use it sold all around the world. In the early Victorian period, French design was already very fashionable. That was one of the reasons that Minton wanted to employ Arnoux. The Minton factory was already working in a revived Rococo style, which had been very popular at the Sèvres factory and others in the middle of the 18th century. But Minton wanted to take his factory in a new direction as well. French design was increasingly influenced by Renaissance pottery and a revival of that, and that was what Minton felt that Arnoux could bring to the factory, and he was, of course, quite right. Using his connections back in France, he was able to encourage other French artists, designers and modellers to come to Stoke-on-Trent, a few in the 1840s and early 50s, but over the years, many, many more. Early arrivals from France included Pierre Geneste, Carrier de Belleuze and Hugh Protat. And these designers, who were predominantly modellers, didn't simply work for the factory. They would have been influential enough if they had done. But they also taught at the new art school in Stoke. Up until the late 1840s, there had been no formal method of art training in Stoke-on-Trent, despite all the designers and the modellers and the painters that were needed for the factories. There were a few private art tutors who, if you were wealthy, would come to your house and give you private instruction. But the majority of people in the factories learned by taking an apprenticeship and being taught by their colleagues. Herbert Minton and Arnoux were to change all this. A new art school was opened in Stoke-on-Trent, and a lot of the French designers were expected to teach there, and they did. The result was that young men and women, boys and girls in their teens, attended the schools of art, went through a formal course of art training, were entered into national competitions and won prizes. Many of them, of course, then went to work in the pottery factories, often at the Minton factory, but also for Spode, for Wedgwood and the other great names of the 19th century. In 1851, the Minton display at the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace in London was a triumph for the company and for Arnoux, who, remember, had only joined the company 3 years earlier. It was at this exhibition that he launched his new ceramic body, Majolica earthenware. Moulded and decorated with beautifully coloured glazes or painted in imitation of Renaissance pottery, it was an absolute sensation at the exhibition. But it wasn't the only thing that the company displayed there which drew attention. They also showed a fabulous dessert service, which was a technical triumph in that it combined both bone china, a glazed porcelain body, and Parian, an unglazed porcelain body, in the same pieces. It was modelled by the French designer Geneste and painted by Thomas Kirkby, a local man. It was so admired by Queen Victoria that she bought it for the Great Exhibition and then commissioned a second one to present to the Emperor of Austria. After that triumph, under Arnoux' direction, the Minton Company went from strength to strength. More and more European artists were drawn to Stoke to work for the firm, and not just for Minton, but for other firms too. The 1870s saw a major influx of artists coming to Stoke-on-Trent, in part because of the Franco-Prussian War, which disrupted again porcelain production in France, and a number of artists who had worked at the Sèvres factory came to join Minton. Among them was Marc-Louis Solon, who was famous for his patio-pat work, a way of building up in very thin layers of slip an effect that looked like cameo. He was later to marry Arnoux' daughter, and his own son, Leon Solon, named for his grandfather, was in turn to become art director at the Minton factory. Solon was rapidly followed to the Minton factory by other artists, including Antonin Boulemier, whose style of painting was very much in a delicate, painterly watercolour style when he was doing contemporary works, but who was also capable of copying works by French artists such as Boucher onto porcelain most faithfully and accurately. And Boulemier was followed by other artists, including some from German-speaking companies such as Christian Henk, Louis Jahn and William Mussel. So that within a very few years there was a whole colony of foreign artists living and working along what is now the London Road and in the villas, a smart new development in Stoke-on-Trent, and many of the streets between the villas and the factory itself in Stoke. A lot of these artists only stayed for a few years, but a significant number stayed for the rest of their lives. Their families grew up here, many worked for the Minton factory, and the families often intermarried. By the end of the 19th century, Stoke-on-Trent had a thriving continental population. In the 1870s, at the time of the second influx of continental artists coming to work at the factory, Arnoux was also working on developing the Minton downdraft oven. All of these have since been demolished, but they were hugely important at the time. They saved the factory thousands of pounds every year because they were much more efficient to fire. And since the factory used tens of thousands of tons of coal every year, this was a major improvement for them. The ware also came out of the kiln with far fewer losses. And within a few years, the Minton factory was selling the rights to its patent downdraft kiln to other factories around the world, which made even more money for the company. Arnoux' importance to the Minton factory between 1848 and the 1890s was immeasurable, and it was reflected in the salary that he earned. In the early 1870s, when Boulemier, as one of the premier artists at the factory, was earning £400 a year, Arnoux was earning £1,550 a year, almost 4 times as much. When Minton's became a limited company, Arnoux became a director. And in 1892, he retired from his post as art director. But he retained an active interest in the company's success. And when, in the late 1890s, the firm was in serious financial trouble, Arnoux came out of retirement and helped the factory back onto its feet, ensuring it had a successful future into the 20th century. When he died in 1902, aged 85, he was buried at Harts Hill Cemetery. He was only a few hundred yards from the factory where he'd worked all his life and from his house in Oak Hill. He'd spent over 50 years living in Stoke-on-Trent and had made Minton the most successful pottery factory of the 19th century. His obituary in the Staffordshire Sentinel described him quite rightly as the man who made Minton.